Winter had settled deep into the streets of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, wrapping the old town in a blanket of snow and memory. The year was 1975, and in a modest two-story brick house near the edge of town, a woman sat alone by the window, watching the flakes drift down like silent letters from a past that never quite let go. Margaret Walker was 51, with silver in her hair and stories in her silence. For 3 decades, she had kept one ritual, waiting for a man who had once promised to come back. His name was James Miller, a sergeant in the U.S. Army, drafted in 1944, sent overseas with thousands of others in the final desperate chapters of World War II. He was kind, quiet, and careful with his words, the kind of man who wrote letters even when others stopped and folded them with care as if each word carried the weight of his heart. The last time she saw him was on the station platform. He kissed her forehead, tucked a letter into her coat pocket and said, "Hold on to this, I'll be back before you know it." But he never came back. The war ended. The streets were filled with parades and flags, husbands returning, children cheering. Margaret stood by her mailbox. Then she stood again the next day, and the next. But there was no letter, no word, no explanation. In time, the world moved on. Neighbors married, friends had children, new houses were built on streets that once echoed with silence. But Margaret stayed. She tended the small rose garden James had planted. She kept his letters in a shoebox beneath her bed, 6 in total, each one worn at the folds from being read too many times. People whispered, said she was stubborn, that she should let go, that James was gone. But Margaret didn't believe in absence without answers. She believed in promises, especially the ones written in pencil on the back of war-rationed paper. Then, one February afternoon, while the clock ticked softly and the tea in her favorite china cup grew cold, there was a knock at the door. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks, not hurried, not hesitant, the kind that carried purpose, the kind that changed everything. She stood slowly, her heart echoing in her chest, and thought to herself, maybe it's just the neighbor, maybe it's the mailman, or maybe James Miller had never come home. But that day, everything began to shift. If this story touched your heart like it touched mine while writing it, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share stories that inspire, move, and remind us of what truly matters. And now, take a breath, because what happens next changes everything. The door creaked open with the kind of sound that only old wood and older memories make, a gentle groan that seemed to ask permission to disturb the silence. Margaret stood still for a moment, her hand still on the knob, unsure if she was seeing clearly. On the other side stood a man in his late 30s, tall with a worn navy coat and snow clinging to his shoulders. In his gloved hand was an envelope, slightly crumpled, edges yellowed, the kind of paper that had lived through decades. He removed his cap politely, revealing chestnut hair streaked with a little gray and eyes that carried the weight of knowing too much and saying too little. "Ma'am," he said softly, "are you Margaret Walker?" "Yes," she answered, her voice thinner than she expected. "Can I help you?" He nodded, stepping back slightly, as if unsure how close the past was allowed to get. "This letter, it was written by Sergeant James Miller in 1945. My father found it while working in a field hospital outside Metz, France. He kept it all these years, said he didn't know who to send it to until before he passed last month. He asked me to find you, and so, here I am." The snow continued to fall around them in the quiet that follows impossible news. Margaret took the envelope with trembling hands, her breath catching as she saw the handwriting, unmistakable, clean, slanted, slightly right, just like the letters tucked away in her shoebox. It was James, without a doubt. She invited the stranger in without a word, led him into the living room, where time had all but stood still. The furniture hadn't changed since the 40s. Neither had the smell of lavender and dust. She lit a small lamp and sat down slowly, the envelope still unopened in her lap. "Please," she said finally, "What's your name?" "Thomas Whitman," he replied. "My dad, John Whitman, was an army medic. He said this letter haunted him, that it felt like it belonged to someone who never got to say goodbye." Margaret nodded, then carefully opened the letter as if it might fall apart from the mere touch of air. Her eyes scanned the first few lines, and when she began to read, her voice shook like winter leaves on a tree that hadn't learned to let go. "My dearest Margaret, if this letter reaches you, it means I couldn't come back. Not the way I promised. I'm sorry. I never meant for my words to become a lie. You should know, you were in every breath I took out here. I kept your picture with me, always near my heart. And even if I don't make it home, promise me one thing. Don't stop believing in love. Not for my sake, for yours." By the time she finished, the room was silent except for the ticking of the old mantel clock. Margaret wiped her cheek and looked at Thomas, who sat respectfully, eyes lowered. This wasn't just a message, it was a resurrection. "He wrote this before he died?" she asked. Thomas nodded. "From what my father told me, the letter was found on a wounded soldier who didn't survive transport. He had no dog tags, just this. My dad tried to trace the name, but records were a mess at the end of the war. He kept it in a box until now." Margaret exhaled slowly, holding the letter against her chest. "I always thought maybe something had gone wrong, that he couldn't come home, but this means he wanted to, that he tried." Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out something else, a small silver pendant on a frayed chain. "This was found with him. It has initials, MW. My dad said he never wore it, just kept it." Margaret reached out, her fingers grazing the pendant. It was hers. A gift she had given James the night before he left, engraved with her initials and the words, "Come back to me." She had forgotten she'd even given it to him. And yet, here it was. The weight of it in her palm was heavier than memory. It was proof of a promise made, of love not lost, only delayed by the silence of war and the distance of time. "Where are you from, Thomas?" she asked, needing something to anchor herself. "Pittsburgh," he answered. "My father never spoke much about the war, but he mentioned this letter over and over. Said it was the one thing he regretted never delivering." Margaret looked at him, really looked, the curve of his brow, the quiet intensity in his posture. There was something familiar. "Did your father ever mention anything else? About James? About what happened?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "There was a note in his things, a second letter. To me. I think you need to read it." And as he handed it to her, Margaret knew, whatever was in that letter, it would change everything. Margaret held the second envelope in her hands with the same reverence someone might hold a sacred relic, something too fragile to open and yet too heavy to carry unopened. Thomas sat across from her in the quiet, the fire in the hearth crackling just loud enough to make the silence bearable. Outside, the snow had slowed to a hush, as if the whole world were waiting with them. She broke the seal gently, the paper tearing like a whisper. Inside was a single page, handwritten in a more modern but unsteady script. Thomas's father had written it shortly before he passed, the ink uneven, the lines slanted, but the words were unmistakably weighted with intention. "Thomas, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. There's something I need you to know, something I couldn't bring myself to say while I was alive. That letter I gave you, the one from Sergeant James Miller, it wasn't just a found thing. That soldier, he wasn't a stranger. He was your father." Margaret froze. The letter dropped slightly in her hands, her eyes widening, then narrowing, as if her vision were trying to refocus on a world that had just shifted. She looked at Thomas, whose expression was tight with pain, as if this were not the first time he was hearing the words, but still not easy to live with. "I didn't understand it at first," Thomas said softly. "When I first read the letter, I thought it couldn't be true, but I had to know, so I did a DNA test. matched against old military records. It confirmed it. John Whitman wasn't my biological father. James Miller was. Margaret leaned back, her breath catching. 30 years of silence, 30 years of wondering, and all along, a son. She read on, her voice low, as if the words might vanish if spoken too loudly. I found him in a field hospital, barely conscious, his uniform soaked, his body broken. No tags, no memory. He kept repeating the name Margaret. He was moved from one hospital to another, eventually stabilized. But he never fully regained his memory. They said he was suffering from shell shock, maybe a head injury. He had no past, but he had a pendant in his pocket, initials M.W. I knew it mattered. Margaret clutched the pendant again, the chain warm from her skin. He carried it, she whispered, even when he forgot everything. He carried this. The letter continued. I didn't tell anyone. I knew it wasn't right, but I couldn't let him go. He had nowhere to return to, so I kept him close. We were stationed together during the final months of the war. I told him his name was James Miller, from the letter. Maybe I hoped it would help him remember. It didn't, but he lived, quietly. Then one night, after the war, he disappeared, gone without a word. Took a train west, I think. I never saw him again. A few months later, I met your mother. And then came you. Margaret closed her eyes. The room felt smaller now, but the past had just expanded beyond anything she had imagined. You are his son, she said finally. You are James's son. Thomas nodded. I grew up not knowing, and when I found out, it felt like something inside me clicked, like something missing finally had a name. She looked at him, truly looked, and for the first time saw not just a stranger bringing a letter, but a face shaped by pieces she had once loved. The curve of the mouth, the quiet way he folded his hands, the way he watched her, not as a messenger, but as someone searching for his own history. Did your father ever mention where he might have gone? Thomas reached into his coat again and pulled out a small notebook, weathered, the spine cracked. He kept this, said it belonged to him, to James. I think it was all he had left. There are notes, sketches, places, a train ticket stub from St. Louis, and one phrase written several times, Margaret, Rose Garden, House on Elm. Her hand flew to her mouth. He remembered. My garden. He remembered. For a moment, Margaret felt herself slipping between timelines. 1944, 1945, and now. James on the porch, James in uniform, James forgetting everything except her name, and a rose garden in Pennsylvania. Thomas sat beside her now, gently placing a hand over hers. I came here thinking I was returning a letter, but maybe I was coming home. And just like that, Margaret realized the knock at the door wasn't just someone delivering the past. It was the future, asking to be let in. They sat at the kitchen table long after the snow had stopped falling, long after the fire had gone to embers, long after the letter had been read again and again, until every word felt like a pulse, something alive between them. The notebook Thomas had brought lay open, its pages worn thin, as if someone had thumbed through them for years, without ever quite finding what they were looking for. Margaret traced one line with her finger. Margaret, Rose Garden, House on Elm. The words were faint but deliberate, not just a memory, a landmark, a message from someone trying to find his way home. It's in St. Louis, Thomas said, pointing to a page near the back. Train stub, April 1946. He must have left shortly after the war. Maybe he was trying to find you. Margaret leaned back in her chair, the weight of the decades pressing against her chest. He was lost, and he still remembered my garden. The next morning, they boarded a flight west. For Margaret, it was the first time in years she had left the comfort of the familiar. The streets where everyone knew her story, the house where memories hung in the walls like framed photographs. But with Thomas beside her, the journey didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a pilgrimage. In St. Louis, the old station still stood, though most of it had been converted into a museum and shopping centre. The tracks were quiet now, trains running less often, the world having long since moved on from the age of steam and telegrams. But Margaret stood near the platform with her hand on the notebook, her eyes scanning the skyline, as if a younger version of James might still be walking those streets, might still be out there somewhere, waiting to be remembered. They started with the address written in the margin of the final page, 241 Westmore Street. It led them to an old brick building, now an apartment complex. They asked around, showed the name, no one remembered. But then, in a small diner nearby, a woman in her 70s overheard them. "James Miller?" she asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "I remember a James Miller, tall, quiet, worked down at the printing press, never talked much but always brought flowers on Thursdays." Margaret's heart leapt. "Do you remember what happened to him?" The woman thought for a moment. "He had a stroke. Early 50s, I think. Died not long after. Didn't have family, least not that we knew. There's a grave, quiet little place just outside town." Margaret and Thomas found it the next morning. A small headstone under a maple tree. The inscription was simple: James Miller, 1918-1952, a gentle soul. There were no flowers, no dates of service, no family name listed, but it was him. She felt it in her bones. She knelt beside the grave, brushing away leaves, her fingers trembling as they touched the cold stone. "I waited 30 years, she whispered, "and all this time, you were waiting too." Thomas stood back, letting her have the moment, his eyes filled with something deeper than grief, something that looked like peace, or maybe the beginning of it. Back in the hotel that night, they sat with the notebook between them. Margaret turned to a page filled with sketches, roses, a porch swing, the outline of a house that looked like hers. "He remembered me," she said. "Even when everything else was gone, he remembered." Thomas took her hand. "You were the one thing that never left him. Even if he forgot your name, he never forgot how you made him feel." They flew home 2 days later. The Pennsylvania air was still cold, but something in Margaret felt warmer than it had in years. She unpacked slowly, carefully. She placed the notebook on her shelf next to James's letters, and for the first time in decades, she slept without the weight of questions pressing down on her chest. In the following weeks, she and Thomas spent more time together, not out of duty or obligation, but because something unspoken had taken root between them. A connection born not just of blood, but of story. A shared history written in silence and rediscovered in words. Margaret began writing again, not letters to James, but reflections. Pieces of memory turned into paragraphs, sentences born from moments too long buried. She wrote about the smell of his uniform after rain, about the way he used to hum while planting roses, about the promise he made that never quite died. And Thomas started bringing his son to visit, a curious, bright-eyed boy named Ethan. Margaret would read to him in the afternoons, tell him stories that began with "once during a war" and ended with "but love has a way of finding its way back." One afternoon, while watching Ethan chase a butterfly through the garden, Thomas turned to Margaret. "Do you think he knows?" Margaret smiled. "Children always know what matters, even before we teach them the words." And as the wind stirred the petals of the first blooming rose, she knew James had found his way home, through a letter, through a son, through time itself. Spring arrived in Pennsylvania with a quiet kind of grace, the kind that doesn't announce itself with grand gestures, but with the slow unfurling of leaves, the return of birdsong at sunrise, and the soft scent of soil warmed by sunlight for the first time in months. In Margaret's garden, the roses were beginning to bud again, shy but certain, just as they had every year. But this time, something felt different. This time, she wasn't waiting. Thomas came by often, sometimes with Ethan, sometimes alone. They talked more now, about life, about memory, about the strange way the past refuses to stay buried when it still has something to say. The notebook stayed on the shelf between James's letters and a photograph of the rose garden, but it no longer held a question mark. It had become a chapter, one that had found its final page. One morning, as the sun filtered through the lace curtains, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and a blank journal in front of her. She wasn't writing to James anymore. She was writing for Ethan, a record, a testament, not just of a love that survived war and silence, but of a truth that had waited decades to be spoken. She began with what she remembered best, the sound of James's laugh when he dropped a watering can in the garden, the way he always carried a handkerchief in his back pocket. How he once carved her name into the wooden post of the front porch, hidden behind the swing, a secret only the two of them had shared. And then she wrote about the waiting, about the years she spent with hope folded into every sunrise, about the ache of unanswered questions, about the day Thomas knocked on her door and time finally loosened its grip. Later that week, she and Thomas visited the local Veterans Memorial to inquire about adding James's name. The process took time, of course, with records lost, files incomplete, but eventually, through a combination of military logs and personal letters, they confirmed his service. A plaque would be added, small, modest, just like James. On the day of the ceremony, the community gathered. Some knew Margaret's story, others came just to pay respect. But when she stood at the podium, with Thomas and Ethan beside her, she didn't read from a speech. She spoke from memory. "I waited 30 years for a man who never came home. But what I didn't realize," she said, her voice steady, "was that love doesn't always return the way we expect. Sometimes it comes back through a knock at the door, sometimes through a story, sometimes through a child's eyes." She paused, looking at Ethan, who in that moment was playing with a red ribbon near the edge of the stage, utterly unaware of the history that had shaped him. "But it comes back," she continued, "always. If it was ever real, it finds a way." That night, Margaret sat on the porch swing, the same one James had built before he left. The sky was painted with the soft pastels of dusk, and the air smelled faintly of earth and early blooms. She looked out at the garden where Ethan had planted a new rosebush, a gift from his school, with a small sign that read, "For Grandpa James." She felt the wind move across her face like a whisper and imagined James there, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as something quieter, a presence, a warmth. Thomas joined her a few minutes later, carrying 2 cups of tea. He handed her one without saying a word, then sat beside her. "I think he'd be proud," he said finally. Margaret nodded. "Not just of what we found, but of how we carried it." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything they had learned, everything they had lost, and everything they had decided to carry forward. Weeks turned into months. Summer came with all its brightness and with it a new rhythm. Margaret began volunteering at the local library, helping children discover stories the way she had rediscovered her own. Thomas started collecting veterans' letters, a project inspired by the one that had changed his life. One evening, Ethan asked her, "Grandma, was Grandpa James a hero?" She smiled, pulling him into her lap. He was the kind of hero who didn't need a parade. He just needed someone to remember him. And as the sun set over the garden, painting the roses in gold and crimson, Margaret knew they had remembered, fully, gently, completely. James had found his way back, not through war, not through victory, but through love, returned in the most unexpected form. A knock at the door, a name on a letter, and the face of a son who carried a piece of him forward. Summer faded into the golden hush of early autumn, and in the quiet town of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the leaves began their slow descent, each one like a memory floating gently toward rest. Margaret stood at the edge of her garden, the same garden James had once tended with calloused hands and careful care. The roses were in full bloom now, not just the old bushes, but a new one too, planted by Ethan, a legacy rooted in soil and in story. Life had changed in ways she never expected, not suddenly, not like a door thrown open in the middle of a storm, but slowly, like sunlight returning after a long winter. She no longer looked to the mailbox each morning. She no longer sat by the window, hoping to see a familiar silhouette. She had stopped waiting, because love, real love, had already returned, just not in the way she once imagined. Some days, she would sit on the porch with her journal, the one she had started for Ethan. It had grown into more than a keepsake. It was now a book of truths, soft and unhurried, written in ink that carried the tone of healing. She wrote about the power of holding on, about the pain of not knowing, and about the strange beauty that comes when the past finally comes home in a knock on the door and a face you've never seen but somehow recognize. Thomas came by every Sunday now, rain or shine. They shared coffee, stories, silence. There was no longer any awkwardness between them, no questions left unspoken, no truths left buried. In finding James, they had found each other. Not to replace what was lost, but to honor it, to give it shape in the world again. One day, while helping Ethan with a school project, Margaret found a photo tucked between the pages of an old book. It was James in uniform, smiling in the sun, his hand raised in a half salute. She turned it over and saw her own handwriting. "Come back to me." She smiled. "You did," she whispered. In the end, Margaret understood something she never had in her youth, that some stories are not meant to end with a wedding or a parade. Some stories end with understanding, with forgiveness, with the realization that love, when it is real, does not vanish. It waits, quietly, patiently, and when the time is right, it finds its way back, not always through footsteps, but through the hearts it left behind. So if you've ever waited, ever wondered, ever hoped, let this story remind you, some returns come not with trumpet sounds, but with a letter, with a memory, with a child who knocks at the door, carrying a name you thought time had taken. And if this story touched your heart, like it touched ours while telling it, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing real stories that move, heal, and stay with us long after the screen fades to black.